Welcome back to another impactful episode of the PSDA podcast. I'm Craig King, your host, your only host, the best host. Well, yeah, I'm the best.
The best.
Thanks, Patrick. And your favorite guest, you heard him already, Patrick Kelly. How are you, sir?
Doing great. Just excited for another week. It's Super Bowl week, so we can get locked in and ready for the big game and the commercials.
All right, Patrick, before we get started, number one Super Bowl snack.
Oh, man, that's tough. I mean, I will never pass up a good cheesy dip with chips, but I got to have some wings. Like, if it's Super Bowl, I got to have some wings.
Let me tell you, Patrick, if I haven't told you before, I love you, man.
Yeah, no,
that's it. That's exactly. I told Tasia last night. I told my wife, her and Sanaya riding to church, and I said, you know, my team is playing, if you hadn't realized, 49ers. Go Niners.
Go Niners.
Bang, bang, Niner game. So Rotel dip and wings.
Yep.
That's
Go-to.
That's all I need.
Celery's just a filler. Stay away from that.
Yeah. And when my team is playing in the Super Bowl, which happens a lot, sorry, Patrick.
It's okay.
I don't like to have a party. So it'll probably be me screaming at the TV and Tasia in the room, only coming out to see Usher at halftime, and then going back in the room, and Sanaya coming down to eat. Yeah, I mean,
that's right. I'm having to educate my 13 and 16-year-old about who's doing the Super Bowl halftime. I appreciate the NFL's helping me do cultural education every year with somebody who was a huge hit 15 years ago. No disrespect to Usher. He's still fantastic.
Absolutely. But. Yeah, for sure. So before we jump into wrapping up week 4 last week, right?
Week 4 wrapped.
Big shout out to our PSDA student chapters who will have their annual Hill Day tomorrow. We have Limestone University, Newberry College, and Lander University visiting us tomorrow. So we're excited about having them. And on Wednesday, we'll have our Emerging Leaders Hill Day, which is comprised this year of our board of directors. So shout out to the 2 Hill Days we have this week as they advocate for public education in our state and for their students and for their profession.
Yep.
So
that's exciting.
Yep, it's very exciting. So we have about 15 planned this session. So we're pretty excited about getting teachers involved in the process. So,
absolutely. So
Patrick, what can we look forward to this week? What do you want to share with the good people?
Well, I mean, so this week is kind of I'd categorize it as that week where you take a deep breath before you jump into the pool, because the salary schedule is coming with 2 weeks to go until the House Ways and Means Committee releases their budget. The Read to Succeed update legislation has now made it out of subcommittee in the Senate and will be heading to full committee, most likely having a hearing next week on Valentine's Day. Is Valentine's Day Wednesday? We may have a Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day is Wednesday because
that could be the gift from the South Carolina Senate to teachers across the state as the end of Read to Succeed courses for recertification on Valentine's Day. I'll take that over chocolate and flowers any day. There's some bills that are in some subcommittees in the Senate this week that are certainly interesting and important, but they're probably not the headline grabbers. You know, it's the salary schedule, it's Read to Succeed, it's all things related to state board regulations that's really coming and creeping around the corner. So this week is the catch your breath week.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for that. And teachers, you know, you received your emails Friday and yesterday, Sunday, about what you can do to express your concerns with the proposed salary schedule and some other items that Patrick just mentioned. But, Patrick, let's talk about the state board for a second. They have a regulation coming up next week, I believe.
Yeah, so we haven't talked about this a ton on the podcast just because the state board released this reg back in October or November during kind of the off season. We were in those voluntary workouts that the NFL has during the podcast season at that point. But this coming Tuesday, February the 13th, the state board is scheduled to give second reading or consider on second reading a proposed regulation that would establish a statewide uniform procedure for selection and reconsideration of instructional materials.
So break that down for the people.
So right now, the state board is responsible for governing the selection of textbooks in South Carolina, your primary textbook. The selection of all other instructional materials is governed by local school board policy. And so that could be materials for the school library, for your classroom library, for student extracurricular activities. What this state board regulation proposes would be, in effect, a statewide regulation that supersedes all local board policies to establish criteria for what can be selected as an instructional material in the school. And that encompasses all instructional materials, not just the textbook, but the school library, the classroom library, even books selected by students in a, say, after-school book club would be subject to this regulation because that club would meet on school grounds and therefore be subject to this regulation. And it sets up a two-part test for evaluating whether or not an instructional material is allowed in a South Carolina school.
So is this something, so if a school in District A has a material and the decision is made on that material in School District A, that will then apply to School District B and C?
That's right. So this would establish statewide criteria. The two-prong test, and that's what the regulation calls it, is first that instructional materials must be age-appropriate. And it defines age-appropriate the same across all grade levels. So there's not a kindergarten age-appropriate and a 12th grade age-appropriate. There is age-appropriate. And it defines that by referencing a section of state law that deals with obscenity, as well as some regulations that the Federal Communications Commission has put out about what you can and cannot say on TV. The other thing is that the instructional materials would have to be aligned to the instructional program of the state of South Carolina, so somehow standards aligned or aligned to your typical instructional program in a school. And so under this regulation, let's say that a parent in Rock Hill challenges a book saying that it is not aligned to the two criteria established in the regulation. The local school district would still review the material under the guidelines established by the state board. They could make a determination. If the family or the district did not like I guess the district would like the outcome. So if the challenging parent didn't like the outcome of the local district's decision, then they could appeal it to the state board. And when the state board made a decision on that particular instructional material book, then that decision would apply to all districts across the state. So if the state board decided that a book was not appropriate under the regulation, that means the book is inappropriate for all 73 school districts, not just the one where the challenge initiated.
Wow. Have we heard from teachers? I'm sure we have.
We have. PSTA members have been very engaged on this, and PSTA has been engaged. We were the first association, along with SCASL, to speak in front of the state board on this particular issue. We've submitted written feedback. I know our members have, and really our concerns are twofold. Number one, we believe that the definition of age appropriate needs to be more tightly defined. Right now, it is subjective in some areas that I believe, and PSTA members, because I've heard from them, believe, whether they're librarians or English teachers or elementary teachers, you fill in the gap, that it is subjective enough that it could end up, for lack of a better term, throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
I mean, it's important to just be frank and open about what this is potentially about. I don't think anybody would argue that 50 Shades of Grey doesn't need to be in an elementary school classroom or library.
Right.
And so if the regulation is attempting to keep that out, not that I think that 50 Shades is on the shelves of a whole lot of third grade classroom libraries, and I certainly hope it's not, because that's not appropriate. But you can devise a regulation that addresses that particular concern without being vague enough that it could potentially capture some classic works of literature, especially at the high school level. So we think it needs to be more tightly defined. And then the other thing is the regulation would allow any resident of a school district to file a challenge. And we view this as about making sure that materials are appropriate for the children that we are entrusted as teachers to serve every day by their families. And so PSTA's recommendation is similar to the requirement in the Transparency Act that's tied up in conference committee in the legislature. Request for reconsideration of instructional materials should only be open to families of students, and staff. Certainly community members have a vested interest in the schools in their community, and they should have a voice because they're taxpayers, but they can exercise that voice through the ballot box in selecting their local school board. The governance of an actual classroom library, that should be between the family, the student, and the educator, because the other thing this reg would allow for is any member of the community could not only challenge instructional materials, they can request a list of all instructional materials, which means that they could effectively ask a third grade teacher to turn over a list of every book in the classroom library.
Which is creating more work for a teacher
Absolutely. Anybody that's been in a well-stocked third grade classroom knows there's a whole lot. There we go, Craig. I'm speaking your language.
Third grade teacher. Yep.
And so teachers don't have time for that. They need to be serving their students and their families. Now, if the parent of a child in that classroom wants to know what books are available, by all means, they should know.
Yeah.
That's about building healthy relationships, but this reg potentially goes further, and so we'd like to see it amended in that way, and PSTA members have been active on this and reaching out and providing feedback.
Yeah, and we'll be at
the state board meeting on February the 13th.
Thanks, Patrick.
There you go. You were thinking about all the books that were in that third grade library that you had.
Yeah, I just remembered to all the books that I read to my students that I had in my classroom library, and it froze me for a little bit.
That's all right. Those are good memories.
Those are great memories.
This thing will go before the state board on the 13th, and at that point, it's important for people to realize the process isn't done on the 13th. The state board on the 13th could vote to move along the regulation as written, but they could also vote to amend it in certain ways. They could vote not to take an action at all on the 13th and wait for further discussion and push it down the line. But even if they pass it on the 13th, a regulation then has to go to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly gets their look at it, and they could revise it or vote it down or vote it as is. So the 13th is a big, important date, and if people have not already reached out and they have concerns about this reg, they need to reach out to the state board member that represents their county because the state board members are representing judicial districts in the state, which are broken down by county. The kind of catch-all email address for generalized feedback closed on January 22nd. But state board members can still be contacted directly, and you can find that on the State Board of Education's website to find the contact info for those members.
Yeah, just go to ed.sc.gov, and at the top you'll see a tab for State Board, and you'll be able to see the contact information. But also, obviously, you'll be teaching on Tuesday, but you can also review the on-demand video and watch what they decide to do. And obviously, PSTA will keep you updated on what happens during that meeting. So, Patrick, you mentioned two words, ballot box, in your last comment. And so before we close, talk about voting.
Yeah, apparently there's, according to my mailbox and my social media feed, there's an election going on in South Carolina.
I think so.
It is that special time every 4 years, whereas the first state in the Southeast to hold a Republican presidential primary, and now the very first state in the entire nation to hold a Democratic primary, where for a few weeks we become the epicenter of American national politics. And so I know people have been seeing candidates in their mailboxes and their social media feeds and TV ads, and it's only going to build for the next 2 weeks. So PSTA encourages all our members to vote. That is the purest and most effective form of advocacy, is to select individuals for elected office that share your views on education and that share your views on how to support teachers and students. That's how you express your voice in its most pure form in a democracy. But PSTA does not endorse candidates. We believe that our members are educated professionals that can and will make their own decision. PSTA instead seeks to provide information to our members. And so I'd just like to make sure to, encourage people to vote, but also make sure people understand what's going on, because this is kind of a confusing election cycle, because we're actually going to have 3 primary election dates between February and June, and it can get a little confusing on when do I vote and where do I vote.
Right.
So this past Saturday, the 3rd, was the Democratic presidential primary in South Carolina. So if you wanted to vote in the Democratic primary for president, I'm sorry you missed it. It already happened.
It already happened.
President Biden won 97% of the vote. So, every vote matters. I'm an AP government teacher, so I'm required by professional obligation to say every vote matters. But if you missed the vote on the 3rd and you wanted to vote, mathematically, I feel pretty confident saying you're okay. Yeah. Biden won 97%. If you voted on the 3rd or voted in early voting for the Democratic presidential primary, you cannot vote in the Republican presidential primary that's coming up on February 24th, and early voting for that actually opens today. So you can cast a ballot during ordinary hours on weekdays and Saturdays at selected locations in counties. Not every polling location is open for early voting. But if you voted for the Democratic primary, you can't vote for the Republican. If you didn't vote in the Democratic primary, you can vote in the Republican primary, presidential primary, coming up on the 24th. At this point, there are 4 active candidates that remain. There will be 7 candidates on the ballot, but 3 people on the ballot dropped out after the ballot had already been finalized. Former Governor Chris Christie, U.S. Senator Tim Scott from here in South Carolina, and Governor Ron DeSantis from Florida will appear on your ballot, but they are no longer active candidates for president. So you could vote for them, but they've already said, I'm not running. The 2 obviously dominant and major candidates that remain are former President Donald Trump and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. So if you didn't participate in the Democratic presidential primary for February 3rd, you are eligible, if you're a registered voter, to participate in the Republican presidential primary. You do not have to be a registered Republican or registered Democrat in South Carolina to participate in a primary. We're an open primary state. And so we'd encourage members to make sure you're participating. Either you did in the Democratic or you do in the Republican. And then the last thing I'd note for people is the only thing on the ballot on February 24th, the only office, there'll be some advisory questions that parties put forward to voters to kind of poll voter opinion. But the only office on the ballot is Republican presidential primary. The other primaries for statewide offices, for General Assembly, for U.S. Congress, those will occur on June 11th. Mm-hmm. And anyone can participate in those. And let's say that you decide to vote in the Republican primary for president on June 24th, but you want to vote in the Democratic primary for, say, state senator, state representative based on your district come June 11th. That presidential primary vote does not bind you for a June primary. So you can participate, think of them as 2 separate worlds.
It's good information.
So people, make sure you're registered. If you haven't registered, you've already missed the registration deadline for the presidential primaries, but you still have time to register to make sure you're ready for June 11th when all 170 seats in the South Carolina General Assembly will be on the ballot.
Great information, Mr. Kelly. Appreciate your time today. Another active week. Go Niners. Hopefully next week when I am recording the next episode, the Niners have won.
We'll just have a whole breakdown, Brock Purdy or Steve Young. That'll be the whole question.
Yeah, or we'll just be here saying that Taylor Swift won.
But she always wins, correct?
Let's hope that's not true. This week at least.
She will find a way even in loss to win.
And yeah.
I mean, she will.
All right, it's time to end this podcast
All
episode.
right.
It's been another impactful episode of the PSTA Podcast. I'm Craig King, host. I'll see you next time. Go Niners.